Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, Daniel and I spoke with Mr. Peter Van Buren about the Hillary Clinton email scandal. This episode was recorded prior to the conclusion of the FBI's investigation regarding Hillary Clinton's email situation. Mr. Van Buren worked for the State Department for 24 years and is the author of We Meant Well, How I Helped Lose the Battle for the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People. He's also the author of Ghosts of Tom Joad, a story of the hashtag 99%, and of the forthcoming book Hooper's War. You can follow his work at wemeantwell.com. You can find him on Facebook under We Meant Well and on Twitter at We Meant Well. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/emails. Peter, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. So this is a topic that's been in the news for a while. It won't seem to go away no matter what happens. And it's a confusing topic, too. I think a lot of people have a general sense of some of the details, but they're fuzzy on some of the others. So can you give us a brief overview of just what is involved with the Hillary Clinton email scandal so that people can kind of fill in any holes they may have in the general story here?
Absolutely. I think there are two issues, and they do overlap. The first is the one that we hear most about in the media, and that is the legal one. Hillary Clinton, we know from the Inspector General's report issued by the State Department, ran her private server, email server, in violation of the State Department rules and regulations. She allowed classified information to pass through that server, and we know that now. The Inspectors General from the intelligence community has made that very, very clear. And she, through this process, kept an extraordinary number of what should be federal records out of sight, out of the Freedom of Information Act process for some 6 years. Those are legal issues, and the facts of those are not in dispute. We've heard them from the Inspector General at the State Department. We've heard them from the Inspector General at the intelligence communities, and we've seen a lot of the emails ourselves. The question about that is whether or not the Barack Obama Justice Department will act on any of those questions of legality. We're waiting to see where all that comes down. The other issue, and I think this is the one that is worth spending a little time on, and certainly worth people thinking about, is the one of judgment. The President of the United States has to make an extraordinary number of decisions on behalf of all of us. Many of those decisions are very, very difficult. Most of them are going to happen behind the scenes and will only be known to us historically, if at ever. And when you take a look at what Hillary Clinton did vis-a-vis her emails over the course of 4 to 6 years, the cascading levels of explanation, the questions of legitimacy and criminality, just the idea of even potentially exposing sensitive classified material over a Wi-Fi connection, the issue of judgment just comes to the forefront. And you ask yourself, if this is the level of judgment that someone exercised that we're aware of, that's been brought to our attention against her will, of course, does that speak to someone that we feel we can trust with the incredible decisions that a president is going to have to make? And I think that latter one is as important as the first one.
So as for the legality question, are there any precedents for behavior like this? The Hillary Clinton campaign has often cited Colin Powell or even Condoleezza Rice as engaging in similar types of behavior. But is there precedent for this? Is this new to Hillary? Have we seen anything like this before?
There's been no precedent for it. What the Clinton campaign is doing is kind of parsing words. I mean, if I step on an ant and you shoot someone in the head today, we've both killed something. I mean, if you want to put it in those words, right? But there's absolutely nothing in common with you shooting someone in the head and me accidentally stepping on an ant, other than, yes, a life was taken in some form. That doesn't even work when you talk about Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice has stated she never sent an email during her entire time as Secretary of State. Not one. Not through a personal server, not through an official server, not one. So those comparisons are absolutely false, and the Clinton people keep repeating them. Colin Powell did send a handful of emails through his AOL account at the practically the dawn of the internet age. I don't think anyone has argued that those emails are particularly significant historically. I don't think that anyone sought those emails under the Freedom of Information Act. And I don't think at that point in time there was any concern that these emails were going to be intercepted by anyone along the way. Colin Powell did not run a private server that he had exclusive control over. He didn't delete any of his emails the way the Clinton people deleted over 30,000 of them. And most important of all, Colin Powell is not running for president of the United States and demanding that we assess and judge him. If he was, we might take a look at what he did with email, though I argue it was not particularly consequential. And so those comparisons to those other secretaries of state are disingenuous at best, distracting perhaps, and really not particularly relevant in looking at what Hillary did, and more importantly, what it means in terms of querying her judgment.
So how personally involved was Hillary Clinton in the maintenance of these servers? Was it something that she was constantly aware of, or was it something that her lackeys were doing, which she's ultimately still responsible for?
Those are good questions, and some of them are not fully answered yet because we don't have the information. But let me talk to that last point first about responsibility. And we all know the expression, the buck stops here. The server was set up at Hillary Clinton's request. It existed at her request. She used it every day. She obviously was aware about it. And she paid the guy who administered it for her. So there was no question that she is responsible for it, and she's responsible for everything that happened with it. We have laws that say things like that. I mean, it's not quite the same, but analogously, there are laws that say you can't run a crack house. Even if you yourself don't sell crack or anything, you can't have a place where people come to do something like that. So the responsibility is obviously very clear on her part. And I don't mean to say she's a crack dealer, though some people might say that'd be a step up. But little joke, sorry. But she has clear responsibility here. There's a direct line. And any attempt at a later date, by the way, to say, well, I didn't do it, I'm so disappointed in my underlings or whatever, I mean, is going to be kind of a sad excuse. In addition, by the way, presidents take responsibility for what happens on their watch. Harry Truman famously had the plaque on his desk, "The buck stops here." As far as what was done with the server, I mean, we still don't really know. Hillary's administrator, a guy named Brian Pagliano, has been granted some form of immunity by the Department of Justice in return for information that he is providing them. And so we don't really know what was happening. Pagliano is an interesting guy, of course, because he was the CIS administrator for the Clinton presidential campaign in 2008. When she took over as Secretary of State, she had a position created for him, one that did not exist previously and does not exist now, and had him politically appointed into that position. While he was there, she was also, and on a government salary, thanks taxpayers, he was also being paid privately by the Clintons to run their server for them. His bosses at the State Department claim they didn't know anything about this. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But it's an open issue about how much time anybody has in a particular day that he could administer her server and still carry out the duties he was supposed to be paid for by the State Department. The State Department has refused to tell us what those duties might have been or what actual job duties he had. The other interesting thing about him is that he still works at the State Department. He's an IT contractor. He's officially employed by a private firm, but he's still there. He still has access to some part of the State Department computer network, which is, as we say technically, legally speaking, a hell of a thing.
Now, you mentioned Brian Pagliano, of course, in your answer there, but who are some of the other key figures that are close to Hillary or that worked in her State Department that have been involved in this scandal. We've heard Cheryl Mills's name mentioned a lot.
Sure.
Of course, Huma Abedin has worked very closely with Hillary for several years now. Sidney Blumenthal has been a close advisor to her. How do some of these other people fit into this issue?
Those folks all have interesting roles that they've played in this. But the one name to keep an eye on is Pat Kennedy. Pat Kennedy is, I don't know what his official title is, but he is basically in charge of all of the State Department's administrative things. He is officially in charge of security. He's in charge of IT. He's in charge of personnel. He's in charge of promotions and assignments. He's in charge of the political appointee process. And his role is essentially to be the transmittal fluid, if you will, between the political side of the State Department, those names you just mentioned, Cheryl Mills, Huma, the secretary, and the rank and file of the State Department. He's right in the middle of it. And if you have a chance to do a little Googling, you'll find out that Pat Kennedy testified at the Benghazi hearings and had a lot to say. He was one of the key witnesses against Chelsea Manning, who, of course, famously leaked the State Department cables out of Iraq. And he keeps popping up in all sorts of places. He was involved in the non-discipline meted out against the American ambassador to, I think it was Belgium, who was, quote, rumored, unquote, to be soliciting young male prostitutes in a park at night, and was quickly sent home for consultations in Washington. And after a meeting with Pat Kennedy, was encouraged to retire. No penalties, no crime, no blood, no foul. And Pat is always involved in these things, and he was involved in this. It was he who greased the wheels for Brian Pagliano to get his job. It was Pat who appears to have told his security and IT people to stand down when they raised issues about the idea of the Secretary of State doing all her business on an unclassified personal email server. It appears that Pat Kennedy played a very significant role in separating what Clinton was doing from what the rest of the State Department knew she should have been doing, and thus acting as a very important enabler for her actions. That Cheryl Mills and Huma, who were her personal staff, were involved in this is, of course, not really surprising. And they can be expected to say and do whatever is necessary, A, to keep themselves out of trouble, and more importantly, to protect Hillary, knowing that if she makes it to the White House, they both will have significant roles. Pat Kennedy is at the end of his career and probably will not say anything negative about her, and mainly to cover himself. But I suspect you'll see him retire very soon after the election in November.
Okay. And now some of the emails that she deleted have since been recovered, and some haven't, and some of the emails have been released, others have not. What have we learned so far from the emails that have been released, and what could we expect to learn if the others were to be released?
Well, it's interesting what has been released. We need to begin by knowing that the first 2 or 3 months of the Clinton time as Secretary of State, there are no emails at all. She has some kind of quickly tossed off excuse that she was still using a Senate email account, and no one kept any backups of that, and there doesn't seem to be much focus on that. So for the first couple of months, we have no idea what was going on, and we never will. They're gone forever. Of the emails that have been released, we have to understand that some 30,000 were deleted before that big pile ever reached the State Department for vetting. So there's another 30,000 emails that Hillary alone or her staff decided were not official or whatever they decided, and deleted with no oversight whatsoever. That's kind of a big problem. Of the 50-some thousand emails that were delivered to the State Department, State has refused to release several, I think it's 22 now, claiming that they are so highly classified that they cannot be released even in some redacted version. And there's some funny noises about retroactive classification, which we can talk about. Of the emails that have been released, Many of them have been significantly redacted to the point where it's very hard to tell what, if anything, was being said. So the idea that there isn't, quote, a smoking gun, unquote, in what we have seen publicly is not particularly surprising, considering that the Clinton side got to parse through them and actually delete 30,000, possibly including something of interest to the American public. Then the State Department got to take a whack at it and redact stuff out of the remaining pile that potentially might be of interest to the American public. So, yeah, it's a pretty sifted through pile by the time it gets to what you and I can see available online.
So, Brian Pagliano invoked the Fifth whenever he was questioned by a congressional committee. How open have the Hillary Clinton camp been with cooperating with the prosecutors in this case? Have they been fighting tooth and nail and not trying to give up any information, or have they been relatively open with trying to give the prosecutors information?
They've not been open at all, despite Clinton's claims from the very beginning that she wanted to be transparent and get all this out there and help in any way she could. We know, for example, that none of the Clinton inner staff, including Hillary herself, participated in the Inspector General's report. They refused to talk to the Inspector General at the State Department. Flat out said, we're just not going to talk to you, which, of course, they were allowed to do, but it certainly doesn't suggest transparency. It certainly doesn't suggest lack of guilt, and it certainly doesn't, again, speak to that judgment question. Parenthetically, we also do know that Hillary Clinton was not interviewed by the State Department Inspector General regarding whatever the heck happened at Benghazi. So that's a little side point there. Pagliano, who's in a position to know an awful lot about what happened with this server, has asked for and been granted immunity. He's taken the Fifth Amendment against his own criminal prosecution. The other people in this Clinton's orbit there have, in fact, had to be forced into cooperating with subpoenas under judge's orders. They have, to a person, fought and so far been successful to not have any of their depositions in any of the Freedom of Information Act cases videotaped. And they have basically kept their cooperation within the legal minimums that they can get away with. The lawyer that is leading this for Hillary Clinton, David Kendall, interestingly, though he's worked for the Clintons in the past, was also the lawyer who worked with David Petraeus, who we all know is the general and former CIA director who was thrown out of his job for sharing classified materials with his mistress. So there's some interesting connections through all this. The final point to remember in those regard is that Hillary Clinton has been maintaining from the very beginning that the FBI is only engaged in some kind of national security review, which even the FBI has said is not what they're doing. The FBI investigates crimes. That's what they do. And so in terms of transparency and working with the people, the investigators, it's a D- at best for Camp Clinton.
Okay, now since you mentioned the David Petraeus scandal in there, how does that scandal compare with the Hillary Clinton email scandal?
There's a lot of touch points in there. Obviously, the scale is very different. We've got, in Clinton's case, 22 emails that are so sensitive that they can't be released in any form. We've got massive amounts of redactions. We've basically got 4 years of her time as Secretary of State that are in play in one form or the other. In addition, Clinton went to Russia and China in the early days of her administration when her server was unencrypted and used her email over Wi-Fi connections in those countries. Other than basically handing the Chinese Secret Service her own iPad with the password written on the back, you can't really make it any easier for them at that point. Petraeus' case was a much smaller amount of information. It was shared with a single person, his biographer/mistress. But it was done over an open internet connection, a public account. I think the touch points here are that both Petraeus and Clinton betrayed their oath, betrayed their responsibility in allowing classified material in their control to spin out of their control. In Petraeus' case, he directly shared it with someone who was not cleared to accept it, and he did it for his own personal reasons. A, so she wrote a nice biography, and B, so that she kept cuddling him in their little nookie sessions. None of that is particularly something that you should be proud of. The fact that he used David Kendall as an attorney to weasel out of the worst of all that may tell us a little bit about what's going to happen with Hillary Clinton. Bottom line, I held a top secret security clearance for 24 years at the Department of State. Never had a security violation or whatever you want to call it, a little black mark against my name. Zero, none. And the idea of transmitting classified information or even sensitive information or pretty much anything other than, hey, what time is lunch, over an unclassified connection, over a Wi-Fi connection in a foreign country was absolutely not something you would ever, ever, ever do. And if your boss found out you were doing it, you would be in trouble. Except if you're David Petraeus or Hillary Clinton.
Right, except when you are the boss. But since you mentioned the issue of retroactive classification
Sure.
a little while ago, let's get into that, because that topic has come up a lot whenever this email scandal is brought up. And a lot of people, myself included, are a little confused about how all that works. So can you explain just how the retroactive classification issue works?
Absolutely. First of all, retroactive classification is a thing. It exists, and it has existed for some time within the federal government, certainly the length of my career. I don't know exactly when it started, but it's not new. And basically what it says is that the government can classify something at a later date. Something can be issued initially in unclassified format and later classified. There's good and bad reasons for doing that. A good reason, is something could have accidentally been issued unclassified, and it's like, oh, we got to fix that and go back and classify it. Sometimes information that about, say, a world leader, about a student who caught the American government's attention 10 years ago is no big deal, but 10 years later, that guy is now head of Rwanda, and we need to go back and classify all those old things because they might be potentially embarrassing or troublesome or whatever. Anyway, there's good and bad reasons to retroactively classify things, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the fact that it simply does exist, and that when Clinton says, oh, it doesn't matter because it was retroactive, that's simply not true. Tagged along with that, of course, is you can retroactively unclassify something. A document that seemed like a big deal once is no longer a big deal. For example, when I served in Iraq, all of the emails about a troop movement were highly classified before the movement happened. And then after the movement had happened, it was no big deal because, hey, we drove out to this town with a bunch of tanks. I mean, everybody knows it because it happened. We just didn't want anybody to know it in advance. And so things can be retroactively unclassified. The next thing that goes along with that, because it's part of the false arguments that the Clinton people have put out, is this question of overclassification. The idea that the government classifies everything, the cafeteria menu's classified, and so, hey, a lot of what that people are saying is now classified is just really silly stuff that is overclassified. Now, no one's going to argue that stuff is not overclassified. It is. No one's going to argue, however, that everything is overclassified, because it's not. Most importantly, Hillary Clinton had the authority to downgrade or unclassify any document that came to her attention. So if she thought something was overclassified, she had the authority to say, let's unclassify this. However, exercising that authority followed a process, a public process, by which she would sign memos and things would happen, and that document, as unclassified, would become available to the public. She did not do that. She didn't do it on a single one of who knows how many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of documents that passed through her hands. So for her to say something is retroactively classified and therefore doesn't count is absolutely false. It doesn't work that way. And for her to complain that things are overclassified, well, she was in a position to do something about it, and she never did. Those are disingenuous arguments.
So where exactly does the FBI investigation stand as of right now? How far along is it?
Well, the FBI doesn't return my calls, so I can't I can't tell you exactly. It's hard to say. Hillary has changed her messaging on about her interview with the FBI. I mean, for a long time, she said no one has contacted me from the FBI to schedule an interview, and very recently she's changed it to, we have not scheduled an interview with the FBI. And given how she parses her words very carefully, that's probably a significant change in messaging. So I suspect that the FBI is crawling to the end of all this. And typically, in any kind of criminal investigation, you want to talk to the principal last, after you have all this other information, after you've learned as much as you can from others, so that you can consider confronting her with what you've learned. So I suspect they're getting pretty close to the end. That doesn't necessarily mean any of us are going to know what the report says. It has to go through the Department of Justice, who can choose to not release it at all, can choose to redact things, the usual process. Anybody who thinks that the White House is not going to be involved in that really is being foolish, because the contents of this report, if it clears her, puts her on a straight path into the White House. If the contents of this report raise significant questions, well, that raises significant concerns about whether she'll be elected or not. And for the President of the United States, who's a Democrat and who overtly supports her, endorses her, speaks for her, to simply ask us to pretend he won't have anything to do with that process, I mean, that just begs credulity. My guess would be that whatever is going to be released will probably be released in I'm just going to say, late August. The Democratic convention will be over. The real hardcore campaign doesn't usually start until September. Late August is a dead zone. Most of the media is on vacation. They'll dump it on a Friday, that kind of thing, to minimize the impact however it needs to be minimized. I'm sure it'll also be 10,000 pages long to make sure nobody really has a chance to read it all very quickly. But really, the key thing is going to be what information gets released, what gets redacted, and how it's all phrased.
Okay, and as far as the FBI investigation goes, what do we know about the number of resources, the number of agents, the amount of time and attention the FBI has spent on this case?
In terms of time and attention, I can assure you when your boss's 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 boss is interested in a case, time and attention is spent on it. How many people actually were involved? I mean, I can't say. We've seen stuff in the media that suggests it was a fairly large number. Other people have said it's not a large number. I think a lot depends on what they were able to come up with forensically off of Clinton's server. So the FBI, we've been told, has possession of the server. If they've been able to go through the 30,000 deleted emails and found little of interest, then there's a whole lot less people needed to get involved in all this. If lots of significant folks involved aren't willing to talk, well, you need a lot less FBI agents to do all that. So I suspect in the early days of this, there were a lot of people involved, but as they start to narrow it down and they start to know what they know and know what they don't know, the number of people involved starts to fall off. In addition, in order to minimize the number of leaks, if you were running this yourself at the FBI, you would want to kind of shed people as quickly as possible so that fewer and fewer people know what's really going on as you start to aggregate the information. So I guess at this point, lots of effort, lots of hours, but relatively few people.
So what do you think the potential fallout is going to be from all of this? And what are your predictions?
The potential fallout, of course, varies from nothing to Hillary Clinton losing the election and potentially facing criminal charges. So I don't think that's really anywhere near on the books. I think if I had to make predictions, and I really am just pulling this out of the air, I have no specialized knowledge or anything like that. But I think in terms of predictions, I think you're going to see a very limp report issued by the FBI late in the summer. It's going to have a lot of, well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't kind of ambiguous things that will be read one way by the Republicans and another way by the Democrats. I think you'll see a lot of redactions, and that's that. I don't think the report itself will be particularly influential on the election. What might happen, and again, I'm just pulling this out of the air, would be that someone in the FBI or perhaps in the CIA or the Department of Justice who feels that the report had been whitewashed could, in fact, leak the stuff that was not made public. He or she could have an attack of conscience, very similar to Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, that said, look, this isn't right. This is America. We're not supposed to operate this way. And he or she could let get that information into the public sphere. And at that point, you don't know what's going to happen. Things could spin in very odd places and potentially affect who's elected president of the United States in November.
So depending on how this report and this investigation turn out, do you think we'll see massive resignations at the FBI? Do you think we'll see the removal of Jim Comey, the FBI director? What sorts of changes do you anticipate seeing at the FBI as a result from the potential fallout of all of this?
Well, conveniently, all those Comey and all the senior people, well, not senior, not the other senior, but Comey's going to be gone with the new administration, right? I mean, he'll have a perfectly timed reason to decide he's ready to retire and pursue other things. I don't know that you'll see mass resignations because, I mean, that's tough. I mean, all things considered, people have families, people have pensions, people need to have jobs. So, I mean, resigning on principle is a very difficult decision. So I don't think you'll see that. You may see one or two that are high enough profile to catch the media's attention, but I suspect that unless the report itself says anything significant, and like I said, I doubt it will, it's going to be a bit of a whitewash, I suspect you'll just quietly see some people retire in the new year. The one extra point to add, however, is that, of course, if Hillary is elected president, this whole thing goes away on Election Day. But if the Republicans are elected, then this is not going to go away. They're going to keep on this forever. It's possible if they do keep a majority in Congress that they would launch a Benghazi-level investigation /hearing / whatever you want to call what happened there into the new president, Hillary Clinton. But I suspect if she's elected, it'll largely fade away.
Okay, and so you don't expect anything similar to the Saturday Night Massacre to take place here?
There's nobody to massacre. The president has refused to appoint a special prosecutor. He's said the attorney general can handle this. She's a political appointee of his. It is beyond my belief that she would put herself out there and go against the wishes of her boss. Doesn't seem to be that kind of person. I don't see Comey as that kind of person. The only chance for something similar to that, like I said, would be some kind of leak that put the information we're not supposed to see in front of us.
Okay. Well, as you were saying before, this certainly says a lot about Hillary's judgment, and I don't think it says a lot that's very nice. And we're going to see this unfold as it continues to unfold. So thank you
absolutely
so much for taking your time out of your day to come speak with us today. And is there any last words you'd like to say?
I just would encourage people to try to read as deeply as possible about these issues. They can get complicated, particularly the way classifications work. If you haven't been in government with a security clearance, there's no reason you would stumble across this information about retroactive classification or whatever. But for people who are interested, I'd encourage them to read a little bit off the mainstream media, to seek out sources of information that will help them understand what happened, and hopefully make an informed decision.
And where can our followers go to follow more of your work?
My work is online at wementwell.com. I blog there daily. I also write for Reuters, Salon, Huffington Post, a number of other places. But one way or the other, everything I write ends up on my blog. And so drop by there. I'm on Twitter as at wementwell. And I echo a lot of the stuff off the blog there if you just want to see what I'm up to on any given day.
Okay, and what readings and resources do you recommend for someone who wants to learn more about the sorts of issues we've been discussing today?
If you go to my blog and search for Hillary emails, you'll see a lot of the law that governs classification cited. Hopefully I've remembered to link most of it to the actual legal documents that are online. If not, you can Google the legal citations there. And read for yourself about retroactive classification. Read for yourself about unmarked classification, which we didn't get a chance to talk about because documents are classified even if they're unmarked. And you can read about these things and compare them to the statements that the Clinton people have made and say, well, here's what the actual law says. Here's what Hillary Clinton has said, and compare the two. And like I said, make your own decision.
Okay, and since you mentioned it there, can you very quickly explain what unmarked classification is?
Absolutely. When you get a classification for the federal government, and Hillary Clinton signed the same document that I did, and everyone does, you swear to protect both classified information, comma, both marked and unmarked, comma. It's the first line in the document that everyone signs. And the State Department has told us that Hillary did sign that document. So here's how that might work. You are walking down the street and you pick up a piece of paper off the ground, and it says, this paper is a list of all the CIA agents in the world with their cover names and their real names. I think it's reasonable to presume that anyone is going to realize that should be considered classified information. Whether somebody cut off the stamp that said, top secret, or forgot to put it on there, or whatever, however it didn't happen, that information is inherently classified. It doesn't need to be marked as such. In the concept of classification, the idea is the information itself is what matters. The marking is simply there kind of as a warning, reminder, and guide. Another example would be that not all classified information is written down. Let's say you overhear a conversation. That information in that conversation could be, in fact, highly classified, though there's not a rubber stamp on the two people's heads saying top secret, top secret. And so information is what matters, not the rubber stamp. In Hillary's case, what it appears to be is a lot of information was retyped for her benefit out of classified documents. She didn't want to deal with the hassles of the classified systems, which involve oftentimes some electronic stuff that can be very cumbersome to use. And so her people retyped things for her so that she could get it on her BlackBerry or her tablet. In that case, of course, there's no marking on it. They wouldn't be stupid enough to say, hey, Hillary, this is top secret, but I'm retyping it so you can read it on your BlackBerry on the bus. Of course not. So the markings themselves are less relevant than the Clinton people have tried to put out. Again, I encourage people to take a look on my blog. You can find a link to the actual document that everyone who has a classified authority has to sign.
Okay, great. And one final question before we conclude.
Sure.
And you've touched on this over the course of the interview, but this does seem to really be the key issue here, despite all of our discussion about the legality of this. Mm-hmm. And that is about the judgment issue. What have we learned about Hillary Clinton's judgment from this scandal, and what does that suggest about the way she would exercise judgment as president if she is to become president?
Well, that's the question I want each of your listeners to answer. What did we learn about Hillary Clinton's judgment? Did we learn that she's careful with handling sensitive information? Did we learn that she is good about working with the staff to make sure important information is shared properly? Did we learn that she understands risk and accepts it where she has to and avoids it where she doesn't have to? Did we learn that she has respect for the Freedom of Information Act process? In her cascading levels of explanations and excuses, did we learn that she is a person who is honest and forthright, and willing to take the hit when the hit is there? Did we learn that she seems to care about the sanctity of her decisions and the American people and how they look at her? Those are questions that everyone who's going to vote in November needs to answer for him or herself. And I think we've got a big steaming pile of examples in Clinton's case to work with. And I just want to encourage people to dig into that pile and come up with the answers that allow them to vote their conscience.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Leave people with something to think about there. And of course, it doesn't say anything about any of the other candidates for good or bad, where there is good and bad with them. But there's
right.
Definitely a lot to ponder about Hillary Clinton and not just this scandal with all sorts of issues. But with this scandal, there are a lot of issues that are brought up about her judgment and about the sorts of things that you just mentioned there. So that's a good place to leave it. And I want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/emails. That's the show notes page for this episode. And, of course, we'll link to wemetwell.com and to your Twitter account at wemetwell, the handle for that, and to your books, Ghosts of Tom Joad, We Met Well. If there's a page for Hooper's War that I can dig up, that'll be on there. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/emails is the show notes page for this episode. And speaking of emails, I want to encourage everybody to sign up for our email list when they're on our website, as well as to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or the podcatcher of your choice to stay up to date on the show, and to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast. So, Peter, thanks for your time today, and thanks for joining us and for helping us to clear up exactly what's going on with this scandal and how it may turn out and what the key points are here. And we look forward to speaking with you again sometime soon.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Daniel. Take care, please.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.